Hi, everyone. Welcome to Design and Dialogue. I'm really happy to have as our guest today, Beatrice Galilee. Beatrice is not just a friend, but a curator, writer, co-founder, and executive director of The World Around. So please join me in welcoming Beatrice. Hi, Beatrice.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Where are you?
I am in Fire Island right now. It's a long weekend, and yeah, a friend of mine rented a house here. It's like an annual tradition.
Ah, beautiful, beautiful. That's lovely. Yeah. So we've got quite a lot of ground to cover today. Beatrice, you have had quite a career so far. Your bio is a little bit intimidating. It's a little bit like, what have I been doing with my life? So impressive. And it's been a while since we've done anything professionally like this. So it's great to have you on. Don't mention St. Petersburg, please.
I was going to say, like, are we going to talk about origin story of Stephen and Beatrice?
No, we won't go there today, but yeah, some other time. Some other time. So, I mean, you've done so many different kinds of projects, having studied architecture and history of architecture. Also, if I'm not mistaken, you're working on your PhD right now. So that's congrats. I guess I'm wondering, as we start off, we've got a lot of slides to look at, and you'll be driving, Beatrice, but I'm wondering how you found your way from humble beginnings in architecture to, the grandeur that is your career today.
The humble endings. I mean, I went to study architecture school, without really having a great understanding of what architecture was. In England, you study A-level, so you have to you sort of gradually narrow down your expertise. So you study 10 things when you're like 16, and then when you're between 16 and 18, you study 3 or 4. And my sort of like best subjects were maths, art, and history. And that was just like the ones I was like way better than any other thing. And I just didn't know what to do for university, and like literally was like looking at university prospectuses and just being like, architecture, wow, seems to encompass all the things I'm interested in, history and art and sort of like systems and analysis and sort of smart people. I just liked what I was reading about it, and I was very the type of history I was interested in was more like sort of sociology and anthropology, like the reasons why things happen and, how cities evolved even. So I just thought it was right up my alley. And then I got to architecture school and was just like, what's this? Like I can't design. I was like zero talented at architecture. Had, really no, I just couldn't do it. I was just like, couldn't make models, but I found it so interesting. And I just like loved talking to my friends about their models and their ideas, and was like super into going to the library and reading. I was like, wow, who's Tado Ando? Who's Peter Zumthor? just was like really stimulated by it all. And then I went to Bath University, and I was head of the architecture kind of society, and so I would organize like trips for my friends, and we would go visit buildings, like invite people to Bath to give lectures. And so I sort of quite quickly became more interested in like the culture of architecture than being a designer myself. So it happened literally at like age 18, 19.
Wow.
And then the way that the school worked was that you had 2 periods of like practice. So it was a very practical architecture school. So the first sort of second year was only half a year, and then you did half a year in practice. You're supposed to go to an architecture firm and like learn how an office works, and sort of that was the concept of the course that I was on. And I did my sort of practice year at a magazine, at a sort of architecture newspaper. So I kind of made the case at that age. I was just like, I feel like I could contribute more by like disseminating architecture and like sharing ideas than I can by like learning how to do like draw schedules and, you know, learning about the sort of ins and outs of design. Like I just feel like this is where I would be best and this is what I can contribute. And they were like, okay, I mean, go for it. No one's ever done that before, but I guess, you know, you're really not going to make it as an architect. So just like you do you. And, you know, it just worked really well. And I started writing at that time, you know, when I was like 19, 20, I started writing for Building Design, which was like a weekly architecture newspaper. And, you know, from then on, I just, you know, it just sort of became my little world, was like writing about architecture and getting published and getting paid for writing. And it just sort of became a kind of viable plan, you know, at that time.
Fantastic. I mean, to know that at such an early age and help everyone else be an architect, I think it's interesting because you can kind of continue to do that your whole career. So should we start the slides? Why don't we?
Oh, I can show you.
We'll see an overview of Beatrice's work and all of her international projects. You know, when I think about the kinds of things that you've done, you've really only had a couple of full-time jobs. And so there's something about that, the timing, your age, the iPhone, the new millennium, you know, that all kind of came together to make this kind of career possible.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, this is, you can see this, right? The icon.
Yep, you got it.
So my first real job was at Icon magazine. And I was the architecture editor at that time. So I joined in 2006 and I left at the beginning of 2009.
Can you, just to clarify, Icon is, or was a leading British magazine on architecture, correct?
Yeah, it's still going, and it was founded by Marcus Fairs, who founded Design.
Yeah, of course.
Kieran Long, who's now the director at ArcDes, and Justin McGurk, who is the director of the Design Museum. Mm-hmm. And Icon has this kind of weird, I don't know, sort of generative kind of culture where, like, so I went on to do curating, Justin, Kieran, Marcus, then Johanna Argerman founded Desenio. She was the deputy director at Icon, and now she's the one of the heads of department at the biennale for design. Yeah, so there's like this whole, you know, I was part of this little group of people that just sort of went on to do exhibitions, and I think a lot of that is the nature of the magazine was very much like not just, and you know, it's a little bit like my attitude too, is like, it's not just that we want to report on what happened, we want to frame it. You know, it's like, it's not enough to say like, oh, this is a great project. It's like, these three are great projects and this creates a movement, or this, you know, we're seeing something more than just what's happening, and just try and collect it and think about it and critique it. And so some of the articles that I would write there would be kind of quite harsh, you know, it wouldn't necessarily, just because it got in the magazine, it wasn't like a thumbs up, you know, you won, you know, by getting in the magazine. It would sometimes be, you know, quite critical. And I think that was also a really good training for me. And then I went directly from working at Icon to my first sort of exhibition.
Well, I mean, around this time, this was kind of the golden age of British design magazines, I would say. You know, there was Blueprint,
Right. Yep.
quite strong at the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I don't know, was Icon new at the time you were there, and this kind of crucible moment when so many others were there?
I think Icon was founded in 2003. So it was, or 2002, 3, I think it was around, that was when Icon started. You know, so it had been going, you know, really well, had had a huge reputation, and Marcus and Kieran were, you know, extremely, you know, big figures in London at that time. You know, it was like everyone was kind of, there was a big kind of scene around design, you know, London Design Festival, all of that kind of culture around design in London was very prominent. And Icon was a big storyline in that. But then, you know, I was working, as you said, like I sort of straddled the time when I was an intern at the magazine, at the sort of architecture magazine when I was a student, we were getting images on transparencies and scanning them and looking at them on white boxes.
Can you imagine?
And that happened a little bit at Icon. I remember we would get transparencies from the photographers. We'd look at them on light boxes and we'd choose which ones got in the magazine. And then, you know, DVDs like started to come in the post of things, and, you know, you couldn't do file transfers online. So just like a lot of stuff came through the post. And then of course, you know, the internet and blogs started coming. And I remember we started thinking about like, maybe we should invite some of these people who are writing blogs into the magazine because they seem kind of interesting. And you know, started to really, you know, work that sort of into sort of disciplinary space of the internet, which was really just coming into a place that you could like display images and be, you know, really talk about stuff.
Absolutely, it was a very exciting time. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about this cover all the way to my right. If you want to change society, don't build anything.
Yeah, this was our activist architect issue, and it was something I was very, you know, really passionate about. Was how do you change? How do you use architecture without building? And how many architects were working with really like the notion of community building and not like structures. And so there were people who were working, for example, with like Roma groups who had been displaced and like would you know at some point had to stop and like build a society for themselves, but also wanted to keep moving. And you know there were many studios who were kind of hybrids of architects and anthropologists and sociologists, and we just were like, how do we talk about these people? And I remember talking to Justin about the front cover and being like, there are no photos of these projects. You know, these projects are like people who are, you know, getting by, you know, like surviving. It's not glamorous photographs. Like we can't send Iwan Barn. And we just, the first line of my essay was like, if you want to change society, don't build anything. And the creative director, Violetta Boxell, was like, we're going to use that for the cover.
Well, I think it's really prescient because I think it must have been very influential on you. Points the direction for many of the projects that you kind of picked up and ran with in terms of the biennales and World Around, et cetera. So let's continue, but we'll get back to that as a theme.
Okay, so this is Shenzhen in South China. And I moved to Beijing. So I was living in Beijing in 2009. And I worked on a show also in Ordos, in Inner Mongolia. And I worked on a show in Beijing. And then this was the big kind of biennale, the first real exhibition I ever, you know, organized on my own.
Just to put this in context, what prompted you to leave Icon and then go into something so radically different?
I mean, I got an invitation from Oning, who's quite a prominent curator, artist, documentary maker, through actually a friend who said, like, you know, there's somebody is looking for a female architecture curator specializing in, you know, very contemporary young studios.
That's you.
I don't really know. And, you know, I'd been to a lot of biennales. I'd been to Venice, I'd been to Oslo, I'd been to Lisbon, I'd been to a few. About them and just said, I think I can do this. And actually and I was 26. So I was like, you know, give me a chance. And I think that a lot of what was amazing about China, you know, at that time, China was all about that. You know, China was just like, let everybody who thinks they can do it. You know, we give everyone a chance, like young people are the future. And it was really like, I was lucky enough to be sort of given that shot, you know, of like, she seems like she can do it. She wants to do it, let her do it.
And Shenzhen had just been, I mean, literally built over the past 30 years, right? So.
Yeah. And yeah, it was like 30 years before Shenzhen was like, you know, a fishing village, and in 30 years had become this like 15 million, very famously, sort of pop-up urbanism of China. And the Biennale was really interrogating that and was designed to reflect on that. So it was a lot of installation projects, like this big one at the front you can see with the cars.
Yep.
By a studio called Go West Project, and they their idea was that everyone had been so obsessed with what's going on in the east of China, in like Shenzhen and in GWANGJU and sort of like Pearl River Delta, Shanghai, Beijing, Xi'an. What about the West? Because this is just as big, they're just not as famous. So he was, Wuhan has a population of 20 million, Chengdu, all of these kind of essentially unknown to the general kind of narrative of what was going on in China. And so they decided to go to those places, to like Wuhan and Chengdu in the west of China, and take find taxi drivers, and just under the idea that like, who best to talk about a city than the taxi?
I love it.
Like, tell a story, and that's what they wanted to do, was like tell genuine stories. They didn't, and I also was like, no diagrams, like no graphs. I don't want to see a book on a wall. We want to do stuff. We want to do things with the city. And so they went to these places, and the taxi drivers drove all the way to Shenzhen from these cities. It was recorded, and so there was conversations in the taxis, and then we brought them outside the Biennale, and you could get in the taxi.
Those are actual taxis from those cities, and they drove hundreds of miles, to arrive at Shenzhen. Incredible. Yeah.
And then you could go into those taxis, and you could be like, oh, hi, can you take me to the train station? And they were like, absolutely not. I just came in. It was a really great project. So like, those are the types of like way more experimental, like how do you display stories, and how can you talk about architecture without being so dry and like, expecting people to meet you on the same level? How do you make these stories, because everyone's story is the city, so it's a shared thing. It's not just a place for academics and architects to reflect on.
Yeah, it's architecture connected back to society.
Exactly.
Yeah, excellent.
And then I guess, let me see. Like a couple, like kind of a leap in time, was a Biennale I did in GWANGJU in South Korea. And this is a kind of an important project for me, because a little bit like what I did in China, but what I started to find interesting about the possibility of biennales and exhibitions is like, how do you make these things durational? How do you make all of this money and this investment that goes into biennales and exhibitions, how do we make sure it doesn't just, get packed up and, thrown in the trash afterwards? Like, how do you make it worth it for the participants? How do you make it worth it for the city? How do you make it worth it for everybody involved? And the Wiki House was a commission that I gave to Architecture 00 in London. And I just said, like, I want you to come up with, so I was a curator at the Biennale, and I had like 10, I wanted to make 10 site-specific commissions. And I said to 00, I want to think about open source architecture. And I want you guys to come up with a way to talk about open source architecture in an installation of some kind, and this is your budget. And and the way that I work with architects is like, I try and find things that they find interesting and then they want to work on. Maybe there's already some research in the studio, a little bit along those lines. And so we were sort of pulling at threads that were existing in the office. And they decided to create an open source house themselves. So they worked with engineers and they worked with programmers, and they had all this like in-house tech already that they were interested in, and all this in-house kind of interest and enthusiasm. And so for the Biennale, they successfully designed a complete open source kind of toolkit for a house. So you could design your house on this website. It would generate CNC milling cutting plates, and then and also the instructions to reconstruct them.
So using the same constructive techniques that they use, and I'm assuming this is the house at the in the bottom center.
Right. So it went on. So the edition, so 1.0 was GWANGJU, and you can see it's all in Korean. The instructions are in Korean and English. And then it evolved, and it just evolved and evolved and evolved, and now it's on WikiHouse 6.0, and
so it's still going, and people are.
Yeah, it's actually a company now, so you can go to WikiHouse, and they also had this spin-off project to make furniture. So actually, the whole enterprise of WikiHouse became a real project and a real thing, and that's so gratifying, as a curator. Like, that's what I found like really interesting about this project, and how also I always support them. If I went on to like do other projects, I would invite them to talk about WikiHouse, to sort of spread the word about it and show how exhibitions can be also starting points of things, not just places where it's like the end and the reflection of it and the sort of round of applause. It can be a kind of weird experimental beginning, for many things.
Fantastic. So this is the second Biennale that you've done at this point.
Yeah, and there were a bunch of other projects, but I just for this, I just found this kind of a quite important one for me, I think, at least.
I love the way that you're using technology to generate a new form of architecture and new products at the same time. And the fact that it continues is fantastic.
Yeah.
What is the gopher hole?
I think it's a real shame that you did
yourself, Beatrice.
I feel like I think something went awry, the fact that you did not come to London and hang out at the Gopher Hole.
I know, I'm really sad that I missed this. Was this around the same time as the Prada, what was it called? The Double Club. Do you remember the Double Club?
Oh, wow. Do you know what? It was around that time of the Double Club. I remember going to that thing, yeah. It was a lot less cool than the Double Club.
Yeah, I went to the Double Club. I was invited to the Double Club, but not the Gopher Hole.
I think that's probably about right. Gopher Hole was a project with my good friends Aberrant Architecture, and who I studied, one of them I studied with at Bath. Mm-hmm. And, so I said to, my friend David, I'm really like loving this architecture curating, and they were part of the show in China, and they were also part of the show in Korea. And through that time, we started talking a lot about what we'd like to do together. And they found this, basically a basement of a Mexican restaurant in East London.
Excellent.
It used to be a kind of a venue, like a music venue. It had like sort of Mexican skulls, and it was kind of painted black, and it smelled awful. And they were like, we can make an exhibition space out of this. Do you want to do it? And so I said, of course.
I personally love the smell of Mexican food. I mean, I would have.
It was more like the dripping of stuff from the restaurant. So sometimes it was like miscellaneous things would just come from this. But they designed it, and they did the kind of the refurb of that space, and the owners of the restaurant were happy for us to use it. And so we just created this open kind of forum for architecture and design talks and events and exhibitions. And the one of the highlights was the Gopher Gala, which was, I can't remember exactly, I guess it was part of London Design Festival, and we wanted to do something for London Design Festival. And so we just had, I just organized a bunch of talks, and we had people coming in and out, and we had kind of all day events, and we had conversations and whatever was going on. And we literally, I think our first exhibition was on a budget of like £700, maybe £600. It was like, there was no money involved. It was just who could come, who could buy a beer, who wanted to hang out, and that it just kind of worked.
I guess this was a kind of homecoming for you, because you were coming back from Asia.
Yeah.
And this sort of represented your community coming together.
So it was really exactly like that. And also it was a kind of a retaliation against what I had seen, having traveled so much and done so many exhibitions, and lived in China, at that point lived in Berlin, and had worked in Korea. and I was like really critical of what London had to offer. You know, I was like, the Architecture Foundation was, you know, I didn't think it was doing anything really interesting, and the RBA same. And I was like, why don't we just do something like better, you know? And I was really inspired by Storefront, and I thought they were doing really cool stuff. And so it was, yeah, it was a really fun project. And actually, it's our 10-year. We were just saying, I spoke to my friend a couple of days ago, and we were like, it's the 10-year anniversary in December of the company.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, we have like a novelty tea towel that we're going to be mailing out.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
So I guess, yeah, this is, I did like 2 years I did Milan. Did you come to this, Stephen?
I don't think so. This was at Rinascente, is that right? Yeah, I heard about it, but you know, it's impossible to see everything in Milan.
Yeah. This was a really fun project that was like really, when I started to work with designers a lot more, and we had probably the most fun one was Dominic Wilcox racing a 3D printer. That was like, we kind of created this sort of big event around it, and I think they had like 2 or 1.5 hours, and so the 3D printer had 1.5 hours, and Dominic had a block of clay, and then you had to they raced to see like who could make the best Duomo, the 3D printer or Dominic Wilcox. And Joseph Grima was the referee. So,
this is it in the upper right. We can see these guys with the lump of clay and the, okay.
Yeah, and then the bottom right is what the 3D printer came up back with, and Dominic won. So it was like, you know, in the top left there's the Wiki House, the guys from Wiki House sort of building the Wiki House.
Mm-hmm.
Did a performance with food. We did a performance with Super Collider that was looking at the atomic. What's it called? You know, the Large Hadron Collider.
Yeah, of course.
They did a demo explaining how that worked, because that was the big conversation at that time. And so these guys are kind of scientists and designers, and so they decided to do like a demo of like using like hand blown glass, and you know, bringing people just to show actually how this works. And they did a tiny experiment on site. So it was a really fun, you know, lively event for the whole week. We had like 3 performances per day for a week. It was totally bananas. Yeah.
You not only programmed the whole space, but developed the whole project, right? Yeah. I mean, it's around the time when I suppose people were becoming more conscious of what design does for us and its relationship to technology. And I love the fact that you're making it completely unprecious, right? In the context of Milan. In a department store where they're selling all these fancy objects, right? You're doing this. It's almost like design as performance art, which I think is fascinating. I've always thought that, you know, I've always said that everyone's capable of design. So bringing them into this kind of scenario and seeing what people can make, I think is a really interesting approach. Design exhibitions. Absolutely. So this is the beginning of, I guess, these guys from WikiHouse. It's the beginning of you being introduced to technology and starting to curate technological projects, right?
Yeah, and I've always been interested, and I guess I'm still interested, just in a kind of very, not uninformed, but just like, you know, slightly informed way. You know, I don't make it like a central part of my practice, but I do understand that it's a major force, you know, it's a major creative force, technology. And I think just always exploring how that affects architecture, how that affects design, like these things like the 3D printer. At that point, everyone was like, what's going to happen with 3D printing? You know, and at that point, and I think the same with the Wiki House was like, can we share architecture online? Like, can we what's, you know, it was very much like exploring at that point those, I mean, this is like, I guess nearly 10 years ago, you know, what is this technology? And I think that's where I'm always find things like kind of, oh, what's that? You know, if I'm doing something with VR or I'm doing something, you know, with computer games or whatever, it's like, I'm curious. Well, I don't necessarily know about it, but I'm curious about it.
Well, I mean, being curious is the start, right? And then the exhibitions actually allow everyone to participate. But I mean, historically speaking, architecture is driven by technological change, right? So
yeah.
understanding how all of these forces are going to influence design and influence technology, I think is part of the
Yeah. There's no skyscrapers without the invention of the elevator, so it's like you have to see all of those. They're everything's a shaping force, for architecture. And for me, you can't just say this is the final product, be interested. You have to say the call and response. You have to talk about why it's there and what shaped it, whether that's public policy, whether that's the client, or whether that's the materials, whether that, whatever it is, the sort of social sort of construct or contract that made that thing possible. Like, that's the story. It's not just the object.
Absolutely.
I feel like that's a lot of my work, is like trying to draw out those stories. This is Lisbon. This was a big show. I was the chief curator of this Triennale in 2013. And so I sort of started that project around 2011. So I had like 2 years to work on that.
Was Joseph Grima involved in this Triennale?
Joseph was not involved. He was the editor of Domus at that time, and they were our sort of media partner. Okay. I think he had done Experimenta,
right,
maybe a couple of years before or after. I don't really remember.
And this is probably the largest in terms of time, the biggest project that you've worked on at this point, right?
Yeah, for sure. And again, I was just, I guess I started it when I was like 29. It wasn't that I was super experienced. I had a lot of experience, but also I think there was like a huge learning curve of like, it was a big leap to go from I'm a curator of a biennale to I'm the chief curator of the biennale.
Right.
Which was really fun and amazing. And I hired, all of the people I really admired and wanted to work with. Like Zach Group did the graphics, which I think they did incredible. And they was their first time doing a biennale. And so I was excited to work with Zach and think about how the role of graphics could really be integrated into the biennale. And the website, I just love it so much. Like basically every 2 weeks, there was a question on the website and you could type in your answer, like Twitter, and the answers would kind of form the background of the website. And then that ended up being in the city. So the answers became the kind of street furniture and posters, front cover of the catalog, and so on and so forth. So it was really integrated into everything that we did.
Now, culturally speaking, I mean, you'd worked in Korea, you'd worked in China on biennales, but how different was it to come back to Europe and work in a city like Lisbon?
What was extremely different was the economic context, and there was a huge crisis in Portugal at that time, and I think it was like 40% unemployment amongst graduate students.
Wow.
It was quite bleak, and there was a lot of financial pressure on the Triennale, and even questions of like, why are we doing this? It's too much money, we have to cut everything. So it was like quite gnarly in that sense of like, wow, this is like not, I was used to having a budget, and of course in China it was like there was no money, but everything was so cheap and everyone had this big energy and wanted to get it done. And in the end, that was exactly what happened in Lisbon, that we just got it done out of like just pure like passion for the project, and we just really got there in the end. But it was different. There was just a whole different conversation happening, and it was about the European Union. At that time, all of the kind of countries like Portugal and Italy and Spain, Greece, were all going through like huge debt crisis, and
we
was a lot of
during. I was just saying, during these challenging economic times, right? That's when the creatives kind of move in. So I remember a lot of my friends around this time saying, yeah, Lisbon is the place to be. Lisbon is the new Berlin, let's say. So yeah. All of a sudden, there's no money, but it's flooded with artists and architects and curators doing interesting things.
Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, there was a lot of pressure, but like what is it, like diamonds come out under pressure. It just was amazing for all of us, and for all of the curators involved. It was really special. So we had, you know, people who I think went on to do super amazing projects and be amazing things. So I'll just like race through it because I'm probably talking too much, but yeah, Andres Hacker did this performance called Powers of 10. You know, Frida Escobedo made this huge stage in the city square.
Really?
And, you know, it was just like, all of it was kind of crazy in some ways or other. Like, it was really unconventional. You know, this is quite a conservative culture architecturally. They're used to celebrating Caesar, they're used to celebrating Sotomura. And we were here saying, like, we're not going to show any buildings in this Triennale. Not that we don't like buildings, you know, not that we're anti-buildings, but like for one edition, we're going to talk about all of the other things that, you know, that make up architecture and that make up this whole new generation of people that are talking about the kind of plurality of spatial practices and how, you know, how performance plays into it, how conversations and, you know, where can we push the discipline. And, you know, it was really amazing. And Liam Young curated this show called Future Perfect. We commissioned films, there was Revital Cohen, Factory 15, Bart Hess. So we worked with like fashion designers, worked with filmmakers. So just using all of the kind of toolbox of architecture, you know, like atmosphere and space and materials and color and imagination, storytelling, and made that into an exhibition.
It's a much more, I suppose, artistic approach, one could say, right? Less about structure and materiality and more about context, politics, atmosphere, like you said.
Yeah, and I think it's a kind of more creative way to think about curating as well. It's like curating as not necessarily a scholarly pursuit, but something that, especially in the context of a biennale, you know, where it's just like pushing things, and like I think trying to see what we can get out of the designers, what we can get out of the architects, what they want to do. And so I think that was really great. And then this was a show about institutions that we did. That was essentially a kind of rotating residency, a 2-week residency for the whole course of the Biennale.
Excellent.
All of these different institutions came and like organized workshops or made installations. And so we had people, institutions from like Mexico City, institutions from Russia, institutions, you know, from I think pretty much all over the world. We had people like 2 weeks of whatever you want to do, and you kind of have to, you know, figure it out yourself. And so again, it was kind of a good idea in retrospect, but like it was hard to experience as an exhibition for the show, because of course you're not there when they're doing the workshop. It's not a great exhibition, you know, so it took a while to take off. And a lot of the exhibitions were a little bit like that, like kind of great ideas, but then when it happens, you're like, what's there, you know? So sometimes people got to the exhibition and they were like, what am I supposed to be reviewing? An empty room, you know. So a lot of the kind of the sort of landing, the sort of hard landing of the Triennale was people just like, what are we, a little bit like the front cover of that Icon magazine, you know, what are we supposed to be looking at?
I mean, I guess this was also around the time that the art world was beginning to question biennales, because they were everywhere, right? So there were just biennales popping up in every city, and of course you couldn't make it to all of them, and how did one distinguish itself from the other? But in architecture, the idea of the biennale was really becoming trendy, I suppose. So
yeah, and I think that the Biennale was, it does offer, I mean, to me, it does offer this potential of diving into things and going outside of the norms of the studio, and thinking about how to experience ideas, and what is the narrative of an experience, like, for example, having a restaurant, like, where does the food come from? Like, where does the materials come from? It was all of the elements of every show, and display that too at the same time. So it was a lot of the projects were conversations and spaces for things to happen, not the end product. So it was almost like in motion biennale.
I mean, historically speaking, if we think about it as purely cultural exchange, right? Then of course, you know, we're used to arriving and seeing the final product. But if we think about it as culture making, which is the way that you're kind of approaching it, then that final product is more mutable and can take any number of forms depending on when and how you engage with it.
Exactly. And we had, you know, we had pretty much a whole spectrum. And Mariana Pestana, who curated this show, is the chief curator of the Istanbul Design Biennale this year, which is going to be kind of half online and half in person. But, you know, she really has a huge kind of ethos and philosophy around this, around the way that she uses empathy, the way that she uses conversation, the way that she tells her stories is and this is a show called The Real and Other Fictions, which is all about that, you know, like everything that we construct around us is a story.
Exciting. You want to know more about that? We'll have to have her on.
She's amazing. I think I sent you her email actually. She's great. And then we did this big call for associated projects. So knowing that we had no money for our own exhibitions, we kind of invited we invited everyone to participate. And so we had like over 100 people proposing associated projects. They came with their own funding and we gave them like a sticker saying you're an associated project. So, you know, there is, so Jaffa Kolb, who's an architect here in New York, he was raised money, like Kickstarter campaign to do his own installation. Some people did radio stations. Some people got funding to do site-specific performances. So it became a little bit like the Gopher Hole, like this sort of place for stuff to happen, you know, and we not able to financially support all those things, but we could, you know, create that environment for people to show up and do
things. It's a really clever strategy, given the fact that you have the attention, right, on the city. So here's a moment where if you're doing something, bring it to the fore. That's great.
So, and then we also, I raised some money to get some grants. So we had 10 what I called crisis buster grants, because it was this kind of crisis moment. And you could apply for €2,500. And with that money, people, 10 projects got the money, and they were, one of them converted a fire truck into an ice cream truck. They found this old fire truck and they made a business, you know. So all of the projects that got the grants were largely projects that you could that were an investment. The 2.5K was like going into like a little business, or, you know, we funded a public newspaper. We funded Exist, who they had some of their own funding, but like we helped them make a kind of community center in a part of Lisbon where there was no public infrastructure. So I don't.
Did you expect that these would be kind of going back into the community? I mean, was this your intention in some way?
Yeah, that was definitely the thing. And I think that was my way of kind of trying to address this issue of like, why are you spending money on an exhibition when, you know, there's just so much, there's people need that money, you know? And so it was trying to think about how to create a more positive feeling about design and architecture, and how it's not a waste of money to invest in design and architecture. It's an investment, you know, and it's about positively contributing to society. And so I think a lot of times people think like design and architecture is like frivolous, or, you know, an added expense or something. It's like, no, it's actually pretty fundamental and it's important. And so I think that the Crisis Buster was a way of sharing some of those amazing projects. Yeah. And they were really beautiful, really touching, beautiful projects.
Yeah, fantastic. So that leads us into a next very big chapter in your career, your time at the Met. What was your position at the Met? And first of all, I mean, this is such a transition, I suppose. I'm wondering what took you from being kind of curator at large around the world to taking a full-time position?
A lot of it was a sense that I'd done a lot, you know, and I was like, I'd done a lot, you know. I want to do it. I want to be another chief curator of another biennale, and, you know, there was this opportunity to to work at the Met, and it was the first curator of architecture and design. And, you know, there hadn't really been a program before, and they were opening the Breuer, what would become the Breuer on Madison.
Sure.
And I just felt like, you know, I remember at the interview, they were looking at my CV and they were like, why do you want this job? You know, like, for real, like, why do you want this job?
Didn't you know that question?
Like, they were like, you seem to be busy and doing things. And I was like, I understand that you pay every month.
Well, I mean, besides stability, of course, I suppose you're looking for stability, coming from Lisbon and coming from that kind of situation. But it was such an exciting time at the Met. I mean,
Yeah.
the Met Breuer alone, I think, was a project that reinvigorated the art world in the city, in a sense, especially uptown.
And I was so excited because Susan Sellers was the head of design, and, you know, I was able to work with her and this whole team of like architects, basically, who were working, you know, people my age, my peers, who were working on the refurbishment of Breuer, of the branding of Breuer, of the opening of Breuer. And to me, it was just super exciting. And I also asked if I could take on the Roof Garden Commission, because I had so much experience with commissions and I really loved the productions. Having studied architecture, I did glean some stuff, you know, from those years of studying architecture, and like production and materials and making and, you know, overseeing stuff was like a really kind of, I'm good at that. You know, I wanted to do the rooftop, and I worked with, you know, Cornelia Parker, who made this incredible Psycho Barn project.
Tell us a little bit about what the Rooftop Commission is, and then maybe we can quickly go through some of these.
Yeah, so Rooftop is every summer the Met commission like one artist to take over the rooftop, which is the 5th floor of the Met. It looks over on one side Central Park, and the other side just downtown Manhattan. You can see the skyline here. So it's just like an open brief. There's no real the curator's just saying kind of what do you want to do here. And so with Cornelia, she had this idea. She knew that I was an architecture curator, but I think she had this idea of architecture, of like doing something architectural anyway. And she loved the props and the idea of architecture as a prop, and the architecture as a facade, as a billboard, as a sign. And the kind of, how do you read architecture, the kind of semiotics of architecture. And then she was interested in like Hitchcock and the Psycho House, which she had discovered had been like the set for many, many things. But she was very interested in the idea that, you know, the Psycho House was just a facade. It wasn't a real house. And that, you know, all of it was constructed, all of it was designed, and all of it was deliberately creates this like sense of horror. And so she wanted to merge that with the idea of another architectural trope of the red barn. So like a red barn in the countryside, you know, this sort of simple, wholesome life. And she fused both of those tropes to make Psycho Barn. So actually, I literally found a red barn in Schoharie in upstate New York. We dismantled the red barn, and we worked with a bunch of set designers, and they built this facade like literally out of every single part of this red barn. So wood smells like farmyards, you know, and that metal is like the corrugated metal from the rooftop. So
it's actually a recycling project.
Yeah, it was incredible. Really, really special. And then the year after, I worked with Adrián Villarrojas, who did this essentially a sort of 3D scan of all of the most sort of like diverse objects in the museum's collection. And it was, I think if this project happened now, it would be maybe even more potent. But you know, it was really a kind of analysis of all of the ways that the museum collects and displays objects from different cultures, and how to liberate them, kind of an imaginary scenario where they're all kind of involved each other, wearing them, and the scale is changing. And for example, like on the right, you can see one of the most like problematic sculptures in the museum's collection, which is a Mexican girl dying, which is like a neoclassical American sculpture made in white marble, you know, of a Native American woman who's been shot. And then it's memorialized in this sort of white marble. And you know, the artists like put it against the New York skyline, you know, and put it around these sort of totems, and place like a lot of Egyptian sort of memorial and sort of dying, sort of like images of people supporting the dying right next to this object. So it was all, it's just like a huge kind of play on what the museum is and was and could.
I remember, I mean, it was really impressive and kind of like a culture mashup, right? And I was fortunate enough to have that tour with you on the rooftop that day. It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love this project so much.
I remember you telling me also that what was interesting is how you got to be in contact with these very rare pieces for the first time, because many of these, obviously museums show only a small percentage of their collections. So many of these things had never even been accessed, I mean, for decades, God knows how long, right? So I think that the fact that he brought them out of storage and did this 3D scan and reproduced them for people to see, it's great.
Yeah, and I think that having the people wearing those things, like, you know, holding things and wearing things, and, you know, it was, I remember we did this thing with Tutankhamun's floral collar that was in his burial, in his, you know, part of the kind of burial grounds of Tutankhamun. You know, it was so amazing to see somebody wearing it, you know, even if it's a sculpture. It was all very, very meaningful and touching for the museum. And actually what happened, because of the type of photogrammetry we were doing, in order to do 3D printing, you have to do like really intense photogrammetry. The museum ended up buying a big, like investing in photogrammetry, and and the whole imaging department that was kind of nascent and then became permanent, and they decided to like invest in it. And so it was really cool. Like we were able to, because before they'd just been using 3D scans and 3D printing to create things for the gift shop. Like that's what it was there for. It was never really properly investigated for like display reasons or research, and, you know, very tentatively. And so it became something that they did. So that was really cool.
Well, congratulations. That's quite a gift to leave to the museum, to be part of that.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't just me, but yeah, it was definitely nice to be part of that story. Yeah.
So tell us about Our Time. This is incredible. In Our Time, a year of architecture in a day. This is, you know, for me, this is almost like you returning to the Biennale, and what better way to have a Biennale in New York than to compress it into one day.
I know. Yeah, so it was exactly that, you know, it was like, how do I do something contemporary in this place where contemporary is like impossible? You know, it's just like, we just don't have the ability to create exhibitions in the way that you would. But I felt like having this, and we did something similar at the Gopher Hole, kind of an all-day event. And I thought about like, well, how could we compress all of everything that happened that year into like one event and one day. And so it was like kind of, it is what it says on the tin. And yeah, it was just super successful, and people really responded well to it. And it was in the Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium, which is like 700 seats. And the last one that we did in 2019 just completely sold out, like beyond sold out. Like we had lines all the way around the Department of Egypt. And it was like, I think, you know, it was kind of a disaster actually, because people were like, you know, how in? We're like, you can't, it's not possible, sorry, you know. I
think this must have been a clue for you as to how to kind of proceed with
the at the time, you know, it was really time, and I wanted to do things on my own. I wanted to be independent again, and the idea of doing something, you know, that we kind of tried and tested in a way, like the world around, you know, it sort of came out of something that that we knew worked, that I knew worked, well, and there was an audience for it. So we did the world around is an institution, but like a kind of itinerant institution. We don't have a base. It's not that there's a space around it. It's more like a sort of neural network of, you know, just waiting to sort of attach to some kind of host body, you know, whether that's sort of online event or, you know, a venue. And yeah, it's architecture is now near next. You know, it's really trying to present all of the things that have happened in that year and trying to make sense of them and trying to talk about them and create a space for people to access and share knowledge, you know, and it's kind of as simple as that, really.
Beatrice, I know that we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you about the Wolfgang Tillmans project that was also at the Met.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was, what was it called again? The Book of Architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
so in a sense, I think that project for me, because that was the only one that I saw, I wasn't able to make it to in our time. But that project for me, just in its documentation from an artistic point of view of the conditions of architecture and this kind of iconic placemaking and condo developments that we were all seeing, I think pointed all of us in a new direction in a sense. And I wondered what were some of the new considerations that inspired you going into the world around? Because obviously it's not just about the event, but it's about the content of the event, right? And so what were the architects talking about, and what, you know, what was really driving a project like this in terms of the message?
You're right. I mean, I think that for me, the promise of the world around is to to kind of share what I think is interesting and what I see as important in architecture. And so my position is always a little bit like Wolfgang, what you're saying about what Wolfgang does is like after one image, you have another image, and they may seem to be, you know, on these perpendicular walls, or they may seem to be layered over each other in a way that seems incongruous. But there's all of this connection between them. So I rarely have a kind of theme, but what I do is like put things together that like one after the next. So for example, we have the Everything game, which is a computer game project that's kind of a philosophical experiment. And then Junya Ishigami talking about a landscape project where he, you know, relocated trees and environments and kind of ecosystems from one place to another, and then generated sort of a new set of like microclimates for all of the little organisms to exist in. And you know, those things, they're not connected literally like in any specific way, but actually they're part of this, like the world around. You know, this is part of understanding our connectivity between things, between objects, between us and animals, between, you know, us and non-human animals. It's like a really about a change of perspective, I think, and not being quite so you know, narrow-minded. And I think that architecture has this reputation, quite rightly, of being this sort of solid, hard, slow, fact-based, you know, institutional project. And actually, architecture is so much more porous and, you know, so much more alive, and so it can be so much more nimble and so much more interesting and nuanced and contradictory. And I think those are the things that I like to come out of those things. Like when you have one person talking followed by another person, and you're like, wow, how could this both be architecture? And it kind of is both architecture.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
that makes sense?
Absolutely. What I took away from the event, and thank you for inviting me, it was great. The fact that you have the world, the title begins with the world. And so we're all at this point where sustainability is the biggest topic in the design world and in all industries. And I think that there were so many different points of view in how we could approach it, right? And it wasn't as direct as one would have thought. In many cases, especially like the Everything video game, which I mean, the idea that we have to be more empathetic in our production to the world, I think was very telling. And I wondered, were you able to bring a video of the Everything game? Or
Yeah, let me see what I can do about that. Because is this a disaster? Am I going to go like?
Please. I would love to get to this because I think it speaks to not just your interest in technology and the future of architecture, but also where we're all headed, given technology today. So.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to YouTube. Oh, okay, I have it. Okay, got it. Here we go.
And then hopefully we could take a couple of questions if everyone doesn't mind staying on a little bit longer.
Okay, sure.
Regards itself as a human being.
Oh. 2 seconds. Okay.
Is that every creature in the universe that is in any way sensitive and in any manner of speaking conscious regards itself as a human being.
So tell us what's happening here. You can.
So basically, the game
above it
is
the
goal of the game is that you occupy everything in the world.
That wherever you are,
so you're a
and
bear,
you are,
and you're a rock.
You're in the middle.
So it's basically
That's
talking about this sort of solipsistic attitude that humans have, and our capacity to empathize is basically our it's sort of based on our own anthropocentric perspective. So we look at a bear and we're like, oh, that bear will have like human-like feelings, even though it's a bear, you know. And actually, it's not going to have human-like feelings; it's going to have bear-like feelings. And so, how do you anthropomorphize a rock or a fish? And you know, so you're asked to occupy all of these different creatures and even like cells. So it kind of goes through. Yeah, you have to go into.
As a player, you can be a blade of grass, a bumblebee, a ladybug, a bear, dirt, a planet. You can be everything, right? And so I think his idea of allowing us to see the world from the perspective of all of these different things is intended to kind of heighten our empathy toward these things, right? So this is...
Yeah, exactly. And his idea is like, you know, you can't talk about like sustainability and environmentalism on human terms. You know, it doesn't make any sense. You have to be holistic, you know, because everything is our environment. You know, you can't just say like, oh, this is a sustainable building. It's kind of nonsense, you know. And so I think that's where I find it kind of intriguing, and his sort of ability to go into this extremely kind of complicated philosophical position, but through this like super simple, you know, like little bear, like, you know, it's like crazily beautiful. So, and he won an Oscar. He kind of got nominated for an Oscar for this short film.
Well, for me, I think it tells a lot about, you know, the future of how we begin to interact with technology and our relationship to technology and the planet and design. And I think this is probably a nice place to leave it, Beatrice. We're open to questions. If everyone's still there. Let's see. It looks like we have, no, we've got, this is perfect timing. We've got a few questions here. Sanam Sudavar, if you're there, would you like to ask your question directly? So Sanam is...
Yes, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. No, I just wonder, I said thank you for this wonderful presentation, because I felt some of it when I went to China, let's say. And then I went too early because in 2001, there were hardly any galleries, or I wanted to do something in design, but I didn't stay the course. I mean, I returned too early. And so I just regret not having met Beatrice in those days in Shanghai or something, or I would have done something more substantial with my life regarding architecture or design, basically. And then my next question to her was, what would be her favorite, because I've only gone to the Biennale of Venice regarding architecture, and what would be her favorite one in that respect of Venice Biennale in architecture. There we are.
My favorite edition of the Venice Biennale, or other ones apart from Venice?
I think she was wondering what's your favorite Biennale in the world, because she's only been to Venice, so she's wondering where else you've been.
I have to say the GWANGJU Biennale is amazing in South Korea. That is the art Biennale in Korea. If you have an opportunity to go, it's GWANGJU is a really, really amazing place, and I really enjoy being in South Korea. I think it's they have a sensitivity for design and architecture there that I always find it really exciting to be there. So if you can, and actually they have a new Biennale. I haven't been to Seoul Architecture Biennale, but apparently they have a new one. So I haven't been, but I would like to go to that one.
Thank you, Sanam. We have another question from Terrell Waldman. Terrell, if you're there, would you like to ask directly?
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, we can.
Great. I'm enjoying this talk. Thank you so much. I've been long interested in the contraction of architecture. I grew up in Detroit, and watching city planners shift from creating cities and creating spaces and suburbs to breaking down whole segments of cities and towns has always really intrigued me. I'm watching what's happening in New York right now with a very busy, wild city suddenly depopulating. And I'm wondering what Beatrice thinks about how this is going to affect architecture.
Great question.
Great question. Thank you so much for coming to the talk. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I guess everyone is now doing this sort of like living from work situation with the laptops and everything. I think that architecture is going to have to just sort of be less obsessed with city life. That's how I feel like it. And I think the countryside show at Guggenheim is not necessarily about that, but I think that we can think a little bit about trying to think about the city in a different way. I think that with the universal positivity of the city has started to change, and people are starting to see the issues around living in cities and the benefits of like sort of depopulating the cities a little bit. But I am not an urbanist at all, but I'm very interested in hearing also what sort of strategies and ideas people will have around how to sustainably live outside the city and how not to kind of desert the city. You know, we don't New York. I don't think New York will ever be deserted, but I think it's something that architects have to kind of come to terms with. It's like that we're gonna be a lot more distant from the city. It's not going to be like a heavy population, maybe ever again. I don't know.
Maybe it's a great opportunity for a New York Biennale.
The world around is open to invitations.
That's right. Beatrice, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time.
It's been lovely to see you. Hopefully see you soon.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.